Good evening, comrades. I would like to introduce one of our guest speakers tonight, Dr. Frederick Mills. He's a professor of philosophy at Bowie State University. He's the deputy director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, a board member of the Association for Educational Development in El Salvador. He's a member of the Association for Philosophy and Liberation, and he's the author of textbook for Introduction to Philosophy, articles in ethics, political analysis, and philosophy. His most recent book is The Ethics of Enrique Dussel, and he's also does solidarity work in the Bolivarian cause of the second emancipation, building a transmodern world. Go ahead, Dr. Fred. I think you're muted still.
I was saying greetings in that I really appreciate the invitation to be with you virtually and maybe someday, hopefully in person. The philosophy of liberation is a ethical philosophy, but also a political philosophy that emerged in Argentina in the late 50s, early 60s. And it was in response to national liberation movements, to the Cuban Revolution, and to some questions being raised in different fields, including philosophy. Do we have our own philosophical perspective, or are we just appendages academically to the Eurocentric history and philosophy and political theory? So the answer was that we do have a Latin American philosophy because if we depart, so was the thinking, from the point of view of the victims of what they refer to as the totalizing system, the US European domination of the Americas. If we start from the point of view of what they call the other, we're going to have a perspective that's not intent on preserving privilege, but one that's critical and engages in a critical history. So recently was published a third volume of The Politics of Liberation. It's 600 pages. It was a collaboration among more than 20 revolutionary, progressive thinking intellectuals from around Latin America who are part of this school, this decolonizing sort of thought that is part of the philosophy of liberation. And Enrique Dussel, who is a founder, one of the founders of the philosophy of liberation in the 60s and its most prominent voice, he was basically the person who led this effort. And this book is being used by the Morena Party of Mexico to lead their political formation, Ministry of Political Formation, where the idea is that the political party is not merely an electoral machine that emerges from the popular sectors, and that politics ought to be viewed as service and obedience to the constituents. So the goal of this Ministry of Political Formation is to train more than 100,000 cuadros, right, as a condition of being in the Morena Party, that you should have this critical history, this ethical compass, etc. So the philosophy of liberation, I want to indicate, is not just a theoretical exercise, but it's something that is put into practice. So what I'd like to do, and just really briefly, is share some of the basic ideas and principles of the philosophy of liberation. Is that sound all right? Okay, cool. Enrique Dussel passed away on the 5th of this month. And he was referred to as the teacher with love and respect by thousands of intellectuals, a multiplicity of generations, because he started teaching in the 50s. And so in the commemorations, we see a reflection on this large body of work. But a few things in his biography I need to indicate before launching into the principles is that he began teaching the basic concepts in philosophy of liberation at a time when a dictatorship, the Varela dictatorship, took power in Argentina. They banned his books. They began with assassination of left intellectuals, and they set off a bomb in his house. His family was not in the part of the house that was destroyed, but he was forced into exile. In 1975, he went to Mexico, where he spent 30 some odd years of his life. And the university that banned him from teaching gave him an honorary doctorate a few years ago. The Emiliano Zapata family, just a few months ago, gave him their Zapata Award. And the Panchos Rojos of Bolivia, who are militant resistance to the coup, they were in the front line of resistance to the coup in 2019 in Bolivia. They gave him a Poncho Rojo, which he said was more important to him than the honorary degrees. So his first major work is where we find the basic categories of the philosophy of liberation. One of them is, I'll just go over just a few of these. One of them is totality. The other is alterity. Totality refers to the Eurocentric vision, which seeks to dominate the world and still does in the form of US NATO exceptionalism. But it begins for Dussel in 1492 with the Eurocentric view that they are the cutting edge of history, the superior races, and that they have a duty to be on this civilizing, Christianizing mission in conquering the Americas and imposing the African slave trade. So the myth of modernity is that there's an absolute spirit. This is what Hegel said, the great German philosopher Hegel, that there's an absolute spirit behind all of history. And it realizes itself through the trials and tribulations of humanity, and it reaches its most progressive point in Europe, especially among the Germanic peoples. So this Eurocentrism is so entrenched of an idea that somehow Europe is ahead of the rest of the world, and the rest of the world needs to develop toward Europe. And so Dussel maintains that even though the colonies have gained independence, coloniality continues and is reproduced in the elites in all these different countries. So that's why he refers to the second emancipation. And this way of thinking has had an influence on what's called decolonial thought that I'm sure everybody's been familiar with. And decolonial thought is a process underway throughout the Americas and hopefully here in the global north. There's an institute for decolonization, for example, in Bolivia, an institute in Caracas. And the idea is that the second emancipation is an emancipation from the ruling classes that collaborate with the neoliberal regime in Latin America. So those are the basic now the totalizing system for Dussel has its victims. And that's what he refers to as the other or alterity. Now, how does this relate to ethics? For Dussel, if we haven't lost our sensibility to other human beings, he thinks many have, and we can see that with what's going on in Gaza, how many people are turning away, not just out of fear, but because they're true believers in liberalism or Zionism. But Dussel maintains that among the victims of the totalizing system and their allies, something very important happens, and that is if we're sensible to the other, to the victims of the totalizing system, because US NATO, which continues coloniality, seeks to turn the whole world into itself, seeks to maintain its hegemony despite the emergence of this multipolar world. Jinping was in meetings today, including with President Biden, and at his table were executives from all the major corporations. So while Washington is bashing Jinping, and Biden calls him a dictator, even just after the meeting, the reality is most people see that we already live in a multipolar world. But in the process of trying to maintain this hegemony, we see Gaza. Gaza is the apex of modernity. It's the apex, it's the sun setting on this Eurocentric modernist ideology, because all of its pretensions to justice are exposed, and even the true believers have to come up with an apologetics that's simply unbelievable. Unbelievable. So in this encounter with the other, Dussel thinks that if we're sensible to the other, we're going to take co-responsibility for addressing the causes of the extreme inequality, the oppression, the hunger, etc. But to do this, we have to engage in the critical history. We have to engage in the study of the circumstances that are causing the victims of the prevailing system. So that's where the philosophy of liberation becomes, and the ethics becomes political. So what are the ethical principles? There's three ethical principles. Dussel claims they're universal, that they apply everywhere. The first is that we ought to promote human life in community and in harmony with the biosphere. Dussel thinks that's universal, that all cultures, unless we're talking about the psychopaths in those cultures, all peoples of the world want to live and develop in community. The second principle is, how do you do it? And it's through democratic procedures in which everyone has an equal voice. Everyone who's going to be impacted has a voice. And the third principle is, whatever we do to advance human life in community and in harmony with the biosphere should be feasible given the present circumstances. So now we have to distinguish between near-term, medium-term, and long-term when we have tried to apply this to politics. So the politics of liberation attempts to apply these three principles to the current situation. In other words, to try to bring about a transformation by deconstructing, by destroying the causes of victimization, of extreme inequality, etc. But Dussel is saying in the short term, that's not going to be done overnight. So he opposes adventurism, the attempt to change the world overnight and do things that aren't feasible. But he also says that in the short term, he argues, we should have the long-term vision before us. Now, some people say, well, that's utopian. We're never going to get there. And he admits that we're never going to get there. There's always imperfections. But the key is self-criticism. Dussel thinks that the reason why progressive governments lost ground, and thankfully are regaining ground in Latin America, the reason they lost ground, the reason why we got Bolsonaro in Bolivia after a progressive government, we got Macri in Argentina after the Kirchners, and other examples. The reason why that happened is that when the left got into power, it began to forget its duty of service and obedience to the constituents. Politics is service. So the importance of self-criticism and of always maintaining the connection to the base that got you into power. Pedro Castillo was elected in Brazil as president and started throwing the leaders of his base under the bus. Okay. This is an example. So the near term has to do what's feasible, Dussel's arguing, and the medium term has to consolidate the gains, engage in self-criticism, correct errors to consolidate the gains and move forward toward the long term. And the long term, the goal, which we may never reach, is what he calls, the philosophy of liberation calls, a transmodern world. What's a transmodern world? Well, it's not the modern world where Europe and the US take itself to be the end of history. It's not the neoliberal regime, which puts in charge 1% of the world's population, but it's also not postmodernism. See, postmodernism says, hey, there is no absolutes. There are no universal values, and that means we're all free. The problem with the postmodern approach is that it doesn't recognize the fundamental imperative of life. It doesn't acknowledge that life, human life in community, in harmony with the biosphere, is a commitment. In other words, it's life itself that uses rationality to advance itself. So this is an ethics of politics that defends life. Now, okay, so what's the transmodern view? The transmodern view is that a multiplicity of world cultures can mutually respect each other and converge on the principle of prioritizing life, of giving a voice to everyone who's going to be impacted by decisions, and of doing what's feasible to advance that agenda. So in very few words, those are some of the basic ideas in the philosophy, ethics, politics of liberation. But I really want to open the floor to questions, comments, criticisms.
I'm very inspired, I'm gonna say. It touched on a lot of things that I have been thinking lately. But I would like to open the floor for others to ask questions or say comments before I intervene.
I would just say, as far as postmodernism, what strikes me about what you said is, if there are no absolutes, it's ironic about there are absolutely no absolutes. It's a contradiction. So.
Mhm.
I'm really struck by how in line this philosophy is with like the lineage of the Black freedom struggle in the United States, like Martin Luther King, W. Du Bois, yeah, like it just feels very, very connected. So it's, you know, it's kind of coming from like a more of like a liberation theology and like a more like spiritual kind of perspective, but it's very, very similar and very connected. Go ahead, Aya.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say that this, what you've described, it speaks to something that is so obvious, but yet not, which is that we're better in community. You know, so even the people who would call themselves individualists, everything they do is in a community, you know, and yet, you know, that understanding just doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah, there's in the philosophy of liberation starts with life And it's always a community of life. We produce and reproduce socially. To reproduce our own existence, it happens socially. Agriculture is impossible without that. So even the concept of the other is always more than an individual. It's always beyond the individual.
So Danny asked us to ask you, well, you mentioned briefly about Gaza and Palestine right now, and yeah, well, I don't know. He just wanted us to ask you to connect it. I wanted to um when I was reading the article that you sent us, it really resonated the idea of the alternality with what we're seeing more and more of multipolarity these days, and the rising of the third world project. And I don't know if this is maybe completely separate, but there seems like there's a relationship of like the sameness transforming into the other. Is that something that is a correct idea that I'm looking at, or?
Well, two things. First, on the war against Gaza, and even the way we frame it and talk about it now, right? The words we use to describe what's going on is highly charged and should be. I think we see the Eurocentric project at work, the supremacy, the idea of a people being supreme and the other being diminished and dehumanized. So we see that at work clearly in Gaza. As for the first time, I felt compelled. I consider myself an internationalist, so I go to demonstrations as an internationalist. But for the first time, I felt compelled to go as a U.S. American Jew and to join Jewish Voice for Peace. And the reason is they want to use our name and our heritage, the Jewish heritage, to justify what's going on in Gaza. And at my university, Bowie State University, here's what I said to my colleagues. I said, I'm not worried about Palestinians attacking us here at Bowie State because there's a Jew on campus. I said, I'm worried about the white supremacists in the Klan. I said, they're the ones that have made these attacks at various places in the U.S. So there's a reluctance. Well, the strategy is to, everyone can see, is to try to identify anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So I'm living the sort of thing Dussel is talking about. There's a totalizing system that takes itself to be supreme and have this right over the other. And for Dussel, there's a face-to-face encounter, he calls it, that we have with the other. And we're having that encounter with Palestinians right now. Those of us who still have some sensibility are having this encounter. And then we can either turn away or take co-responsibility. Take co-responsibility. So this means if we take co-responsibility, we have to act. And that's where we see all this resistance all around the world. So we can relate this criticism of modernity, the critique of modernity, to what's going on right now. And I think the modernist project is coming to an apex in Gaza. And the reason is, it's not just a war of Israel against Gaza, the project of ethnic cleansing. It's more than that, because all different countries, all the world has a relationship with what's going on in Gaza. The UN is anemically weighing in with its criticisms. And we can see the contradictions building in terms of Iran and Hezbollah posing the possibility of opening up another front. And we see China and Russia also poised to defend their interest in the Gulf. And then we see in Latin America, we see some Latin American countries recalling telling their ambassador, you got to leave, you're persona non grata. Okay, I believe that's Colombia. Colombia wants to even take Israel to the Hague. So what I'm saying is this is a worldwide phenomenon, and I believe it is this modernity, which is the Eurocentric project of domination. It's being played out right now in Gaza. So Gaza is a microcosm of a macro project, on the one side of retaining world domination, and on the other side, the emergence of a multipolar world, of the rights of peoples, the basic rights of and dignity, equal dignity of all peoples. And then your second point was about sameness. So the idea of the same is the totalizing system. It's the system that either tries to turn everything else into itself, everything's got to be European, or liquidates, marginalizes, neutralizes the other. So this project is already ending. The ideology of US European hegemony is exhausted. Liberalism, as Chris Hedges said, is dead. Look what happened in front of the DNC. You had true believers in the Democratic Party getting thrown down the stairs. So this is a critical moment.
That is definitely is a critical moment. It seems as the change in which the world is, like the pace at which the world is changing, has accelerated so fast in the past couple of months. And I hope that the suffering and like the genocide we're seeing in Gaza is just the tail of the beast wagging, as it cannot contain its death, its imperial demise, and we can actually live in a peaceful democratic world. I don't know if anybody would like to say anything.
I'm actually curious about professor's thoughts on Argentina's election this Sunday, especially because the left has called for they haven't called for a vote to either party, and so one of the parties is like a fascist, and the other one is the quote unquote left, that I wouldn't call them a left. So I'm really curious on the professor's thoughts on the leftist, the Workers' Party calling for a no vote.
Yeah, I think Fernandez, because the president, because he moved to the center and didn't fight for social investment, but made deals with the IMF, I think it weakened the left in Argentina. Milei is to the right of Trump. Okay, can you believe that? The guy's to the right of Trump. And I'm not exaggerating, saying the dude's out of his mind, really. Can't control himself, and yet he's quite a popular figure. So how do we explain this in the country that had the Kirchners, Christina Kirchner, in that great tradition of insisting on the Bolivarian cause, being an ally of Venezuela, despite it being under attack. How did Argentina get to this point? And I think it's the suffering caused by austerity, and hyperinflation. So what can we hope for in Argentina? The center? I don't know. What do you think?
I personally don't have I don't have an opinion on what we can hope for. I think that even if Massa wins the election, then next election is gonna be the same. We're gonna have Milei again because I feel like we have been moving towards the right due to the corruption of the Kirchners. That's why we first got Macri. And now we have someone even worse than Macri, and Macri is like really bad already. So, but I'm curious on what your thoughts are on the Workers' Party calling for, the Workers' Party said they are not going to vote for either candidate, and they called the people to not vote for either candidate. And the people who go for Massa or the Peronistas are upset at the left for not supporting Massa. And that's what I would like to know your thoughts on.
Wow. It's, if you ask me if I'm going to vote for the Democratic Party, just to give an analogy, because it's a lesser evil, the answer is no. But the answer is no, I'm not going to vote. I don't even think it's a lesser. I mean, how do you compare two warmongers? I mean, how do you compare them? So no, we need a third way, even if it means that Trump gets in. So I know where I stand here, but I don't know where I would stand in Argentina. I'm just being frank. I don't know. I claim to subscribe to the idea you do what's feasible in the short term to try to preserve progressive ground. So if I knew more about the balance of forces in Argentina, I don't know enough about the balance of forces to be sure if I agree with the Workers' Party.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I copped out on that, but it's true. I don't know enough.
Can I give my opinion very uninformed, but just from I would vote for Massa just because if they don't destroy the central bank, first thing, and if they join BRICS, then I think that the international order could work in their favor. And I even think that the leftists are going to have to compromise in having capitalist development, but with a socialist-oriented, like international sphere. And I think that is what BRICS could provide, like capitalist development in the third world, industrialize the countries, but with a socialist orientation. And I think that is like a short, middle, strategic possibility. And that is the only reason that I would vote for Massa. But I'm not super informed. It's just that idea. But I'm from Costa Rica, so if things were more progressive here, that would be something that I imagine that would make sense. That could win people's minds over. Like.
You've nudged me over to you've nudged me a little bit to seeing it might be a good idea to, I mean, I can't put myself in the shoes of Argentina, but that's a good argument. Yeah.
Yeah, I must say that the phrase that you said, I don't know if it's yours, but I'm gonna steal it. That life itself uses rationality to advance life.
Yeah,
Was a
that
very
is
good phrase.
Dussel saying that, and it comes from, he's subtly criticizing Hegel. You see, Hegel says that reason, that absolute spirit behind all of history, is a form of rationality. So that reason itself is coming to realize itself through history. So everything that goes on in history is a result of this self-reflection of the absolute spirit. So Dussel turns it on its head and says, life polarizes the world in terms of its vital interests. All living things do that. All living things gravitate toward that which will allow them to survive, and they move back in the face of that which threatens their life. So life takes on rationality in order to advance the project of life itself.
I think it, it might be also fair to say that human beings are maybe not entirely rational all the time, and that maybe this is not a bad thing, that some of our irrational, like our passion, would get us to do something that our rational self would tell us is not possible, but disbelieving the irrational self might be the way to overcome the ego or something. I don't know.
Wow. Dussel, his early work, he said that to really commit to liberation, we have to be disciples of popular militancy. So that means, what's the role of philosophy? What's the role of the politics of liberation for Dussel is not to pretend that you're the vanguard or the retroguardia, but you're holding a lamp, accompanying what he called la militancia popular. And that's what the theology of liberation also intended. It's not a position of domination. It's a position of learning and respecting the other. But I like that image you evoke.
Nobody has any other questions? I just wanted to make a final, it's a final question. I was looking through social media, and it was funny. Like, I've never encountered Enrique Dussel before, but I read your article and was researching you, and immediately the algorithm knew what it needed to show me. So then I started seeing stuff in my social media about Enrique Dussel, and there's an interview in which they ask him, well, he was saying that he discovered the metaphysical aspect of Marx, in which labor creates value out of nowhere. And I don't understand that, so I wanted you to explain it. But first, I also wanted to ask, from my very limited understanding of economics, economic history, the idea of labor value, before that, there was the idea that value came from the sun, and from like the agriculturalists. And I know there's some philosophical traditions lately that come back to this, but I don't know if there is a relationship between that metaphysical question. And I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, sure. Dussel engaged in a thorough study of Marx, basically read everything available in the archives, including the letters, and he wrote 5 books projecting a Marx, a humanist Marx, the rereading, and actually found Marx to be consistent with this philosophy of liberation. And he found in Marx the idea of trabajo vivo, living labor that you referred to. Living labor is distinguished from la capacidad de obrar, from el poder de obrar, from the power of labor. So here's what happens. The worker, in order to reproduce his or her their life, has to, and under capitalism, right, go to work for the capitalist. And what happens is that living labor objectifies itself, externalizes itself in the act of laboring. So the factory worker, and so this is in Marx's manuscripts, the young Marx manuscripts, the theory of alienated labor. And what happens is when the factory worker starts expending his or her energy, that life energy gets objectified, externalized out there in the world in the product that belongs to the capitalist. And there's the extraction of surplus value, which for Marx is unpaid labor. But what's the importance of trabajo vivo, of living labor? It never gets completely objectified. It never gets completely instrumentalized. As I work in labor, there's ever new life flowing out of me that I can apply and externalize. So the capitalist doesn't conquer completely living labor. I retain a freedom as a worker. Dussel calls it poder ser, the ability to be, the ability to realize something different. And that's why workers can come together, collectively bargain, or come together and transform their situation. So living labor is different from externalized labor. Externalized labor already belongs, and it's already out there in the world, belongs to the capitalist to make their surplus value. Living labor is something we always retain in our autonomy. Now, it can be crushed, of course. That's what the US rendition was all about, to break human beings in Guantanamo. So, of course, there's exceptions. But he's referring to the situation of workers that retain this living labor. Yeah. Did that make sense?
In practical senses, could the living labor also be the ability to pursue liberation? Or
Yes. So living labor ends up being the same thing as Dussel's earlier concept of the critical ethical point of view. The critical ethical point of view is my ability to step back from the totalizing system and critique it. See, for Dussel, you can't use the categories of the dominant ideology to critique it. It's not going to get you there. It's a circle. So what Dussel suggests is that the critical, ethically committed consciousness has to step back and consider the entire totalizing system and its ideology and call it into question. That's why critique is itself a form of practice.
I'm speechless. I don't. It's very. I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm sorry. It's very quiet.
I've also been trying to find my voice a little bit, not always sure what to say, right? So then I don't want to hit unmute if I don't know what I'm going to say ahead of time a little bit. But I like what you said about critique is a form of practice, because I find the more I try to do this online stuff with a mic and camera, I have to learn how to make my critiques better, and just doing it helps.
Yeah, that's true. I building on that, like critique is like a practice, and it's its own form of like labor, its own form of engaging in liberation. And yeah, I think we're all learning, and we all practice through this, through like conversations like these, and reading groups and study groups, that we learn how to, like, develop and contribute the way that develop the way that we contribute critically and intellectually towards that community that is trying to find and develop these concepts of liberation that we can apply in our own organizing and in our own activism. Because I think these theories and these concepts are very helpful. Actually, they help us conceptualize and think about like midterm and long term, as opposed to always short term. I think a lot of the activism and organizing doesn't always have like a middle or a long game, which can help us see beyond the next few days or weeks. Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. That was a great talk. I'm sorry for being so uncomfortable socially today. It's been a tough week, and a lot of thinking and a lot of stuff in other areas. From a personal perspective, yeah, that's what Daniel also mentioned. It also seems to put to perspective how to plan for a revolutionary or a liberating life, right? If one is a person from the left, how one is going to struggle, and how is one going to work in trying to achieve this. And the principles that you mentioned from the ethics of liberation are a very good guide, and particularly the third one with a short, mid, and long, and the feasible, and offer a structure for organizing oneself.
Well, I'd just like to add one thing about the three principles, is that they're integral. In other words, I can't isolate any of them from the other two. If I want to advance human life in harmony with nature, how do I do it? I have to employ the second principle. I have to be democratic. I can't just decide what's going to make everybody's life better. No. So the second principle has to inform the first, and I have to do what's feasible. If we isolate feasibility, we can have horrific things happen, like the feasibility of bombing Gaza, destroying the infrastructure. It's all that's technically feasible what Israel's doing, but of course it violates the other two principles. So these principles are integral. We can't democratically decide to do something that's going to harm life and the biosphere. So the principles are integral. So I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
Now that you mentioned that, before we move to the second topic, I just wanted to ask you a quick question, because remember that you mentioned you were Jewish, and I think Dussel is also too, and Marx is also Jewish, and there's a lot of, and was ever a time in your life in which you viewed the Israel state favorably, and did this change at some point in history
Yes, when I was 10 years old, I went to Hebrew school because Jewish boys, girls, bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, learning Hebrew and everything. And I was taught the Palestinians don't want Jewish land, they want Jewish blood. And imagine a 10-year-old being shown videos of the Holocaust, and then Palestinians, there with, of course, they were actors gunning. I mean, this was heavy propaganda, heavy stuff. And I let the issue stay in the background until I got to American University. And there was an invasion of Lebanon. And I encountered, of course, Palestinians on campus and realized, they're brothers and sisters. What's going, something's terribly wrong with what I was indoctrinated with. And I was in a group called Latin American, North American Solidarity Committee, and we were asked to send somebody to give a solidarity message to the Palestinian Student Association. So I gave the solidarity message, and believe me, I took some flack the next day. You can imagine, okay? So I did undergo this discovery that I was in the cave of ignorance. And for me, the never again message is a very serious one, because it does mean, as you've heard many others say, never again applies to everybody. Never again means never again for everybody. So it's actually my heritage that makes a claim on me to take a position against the genocide in Gaza. It's pretty simple in a way. Some people say, oh, it's confusing, it's complex. No, it isn't.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I never told anyone that. But that's the truth.
I think we should move to the second part of the course, right? Wesam and Ariana are going to speak. I think we should start with Wesam. And Daniel, I also want to ask you, if we want to keep recording. Oh, yeah, we're still here.
Should I go ahead and should I cut the recording, Andres, you think? Okay.
No, I don't know. It depends on the speakers. Because the idea is that we're eventually going to upload these to YouTube. So I don't know if you.
Yeah. Is Wesam? What do you think? Would you want to share this? Would you want us to share this on the recording?
Not a problem for me.
Okay. Sounds
But
good.
I can't speak for Ariana.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can ask
Not a
Ariana
problem.
after.
I'm good.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys.
Go ahead, Wesam.
All right. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for attending this. Good to see all these familiar faces. Well, it's been a pretty hectic couple of weeks for me. As I think everyone here knows by now, I was arrested in Calgary at a demonstration for Palestine 2 Sundays ago. I was arrested and charged with causing a disturbance, and the reason for the arrest and charge has been made clear to me by the local police was related solely to my use of the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." We had been told that they were looking at turning that into hate speech, and on the day of, they decided to arrest me for it. Took us a bit by surprise, actually, but now I have news that those charges are probably not going to stick. I can confirm that it is very, very likely that the prosecution is going to be staying my case, staying the charges, which basically means they're not dropping it. So the case isn't dropped completely, but what it means is that they're not proceeding with prosecution. They have 12 months to go ahead with prosecution. They can reactivate it if they want, but at the moment they've said they're not going to go ahead with it. It's a bit of a bit of a cowardly move, I think, a bit of a bullshit move. It means they don't have to admit that they were wrong, and they have this thing hanging over me for the next 12 months. But we'll push on anyway. I'm going to be resuming my role in demonstrations. I should have mentioned one of the conditions of my release has been that I'm not even allowed to attend or organize demonstrations. I'm not allowed to hold any sound amplification device as the conditions of my release. So I mean, we all know what this is. Yeah, it shouldn't be any surprise to us. This is the repression of the imperialist states, yeah, which are seeing this immense global movement in solidarity with Palestine. And really, I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is, I think, the biggest global protest movement that we maybe have ever seen in history. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say, given the numbers and length. And the number of people that have consistently come out, and there are millions in some places. And it has got the imperialist powers shitting themselves, basically. And they should be. They should be. You know, it really is a case where, honestly, given what we've seen around the world and the ways in which, even in places where there is clearly enormous popular support for ceasefire, the governments of these countries, and particularly of countries like the United States, Canada, a lot of Europe, where like there are majorities of people who have been polled and showed like a clear majority is in favor of ceasefire. I mean, in the United States, even the polls I've seen said that even a majority of Republicans, let alone, you know, Democrats and non-identified voters, have said they want a ceasefire. And yet Joe Biden, his response has been, what was it? No way, not a chance, right? So I mean, this is a period that I don't think I've certainly ever seen in my life, where not only are we clearly seeing this in the midst of this really vicious and horrendous act of genocide that requires urgent action, and millions of people around the world understand that clearly, and they've come out urgently demanding action and have been unable to push their governments to change. And and also, I mean, I think it's pretty significant that even within some of the established like spheres where we have not seen a whole lot of opposition and dissidents in the past, we are starting to see, like, even within the structures of the ruling system, people are making, you know, acts of dissidence or rebellion at varying degrees of, strength. So, like, there was an internal memo in the State Department, apparently signed by, I don't know the exact number. I heard that it was hundreds of people, or over 100 people, maybe within the State Department, saying our president is enabling a genocide. I've seen the BBC, which is a horrendously, you know, pro-Israel. I mean, that is as pro-Israel almost as you get in media. Like, there was a few years ago, a former Middle East correspondent with the BBC. His name is Tim Llewellyn. He came out publicly and he said that his experience as a Middle East correspondent for BBC convinced him that, and his exact words were, in a BBC newsroom, the life of an Israeli is worth more than the lives of any number of Palestinians. So that's the BBC. And yet, even the BBC, I saw today, they have a piece exploring Israel's claims about this hospital. I'm sure people are sort of aware of the videos that Israel has been putting out. I mean, just the propaganda that is just mind blowing, that anyone believes this, as if Israel should be producing any of this at all. Like, this is the kind of facts that you need an independent investigator to investigate, not literally the culprit of the crime investigating their own justifications and producing the material. And the BBC, surprisingly to me, actually took issue with that and went at the videos that Israel had produced on the hospital, and, you know, put out a pretty decent piece saying, yeah, actually, this just doesn't hold. This isn't evidence of anything, and there's reason to doubt it, like a lot of reason to doubt it. And even NBC had Netanyahu on the other day, and, you know, wasn't as confrontational as I would like, but at least he was asked. He was kind of pushed on this question of like, how many civilians do you think you've killed? Right? I mean, this is not something we're used to seeing Israeli leaders asked in Western media, right? The situation is like really dire I mean, it's dire for the people in Gaza. Obviously, it is dire for people around the world who are facing varying degrees of suppression. I've heard that several hundred protesters in Jordan have been arrested because of their role in this, in Palestine demonstrations. But at the same time, the situation is extremely chaotic for the powers that be. And all around the world, the question is being posed of what do these democracies really mean? And frankly, in my opinion, the question of revolution is being posed right now around the world. And what is happening in Palestine has sent shockwaves around the world. And I don't think there is any going back from that. And we need to be honing ourselves for this coming period, because I don't know what the future is going to hold, but the things that people have clearly seen, large numbers of people have clearly seen their governments doing. I mean, we knew it was bad, but we are literally witnessing the major powers of the Atlantic countries actively supporting, justifying, providing political cover for a genocide, a genocide that has been going on for weeks over the enormous protestations of the majority of the people of the world. I've never seen a period like this, and so we need to be prepared with our arguments. And so I've kind of prepared a bit of a talk about one of those arguments that we need to be ready to make, which is, what exactly does this chant "from the river to the sea" mean? Right? From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's been much demonized. Yeah, it's been coming under an enormous amount of attack, and it has been like kind of the center of a big public global debate. So you've had like Harvard professors, legal experts weigh in on this. Media across the country here in Canada is talking about this. Obviously, in light of the charge that I received, it is a huge question that people are posing. And so it's worth reviewing. And I have to say, I mean, I first of all, first starting point is, there's nothing anti-Semitic about this phrase whatsoever. Any implication that it is like just a clear, blatant attempt to demonize people fighting against genocide. That's the first starting point here. And in terms of what the phrase means, it's actually kind of a vague phrase generally. It's kind of just like freedom for Palestine. It's basically saying free Palestine. It's a vague phrase. There's no, the phrase itself doesn't contain a framework of what freedom for Palestine means. So people will chant this phrase even if they're not in favor of a one-state solution. They might be in favor of a two-state solution. They might not have a clear perspective on what they think a solution to the Israel-Palestine question might look like. So it's not like the phrase itself contains anything explicitly, clear about what is called for. But that said, I have to say that I think that if I was a Zionist and I was advising the Zionist movement on which of the chants that you hear at Palestine protests is the one that should be attacked and is the most dangerous, at least to the Zionists, I would say this is probably the phrase, right? I would say this is it. And I'll tell you why. The phrase is "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." It goes a little further than the just free Palestine, because it says, from the river to the sea. That's the geographical designation. It refers to the entirety of historic Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And it calls for freedom. Now, as I think we all know, the present situation in Palestine is that between the river and the sea, there is this thing, which is the Israeli state, and obviously sitting in between the occupied West Bank and Gaza. So the phrase itself does raise the question of the existence of the Israeli state. It does kind of pose the question. It doesn't necessarily give an answer to it, but it does raise the question. And raising that question of the existence of the Israeli state has been basically a heretical, like you are almost not allowed to question that in any public discourse around this question. And I think we should talk about that, because and just to put put some more on that. Like if people will remember the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance (IHRA) definition of anti-Semitism, that was kind of a big thing a few years ago. Many institutions and parties and governments around the world have kind of adopted this as like an official definition of anti-Semitism, and there were a lot of people opposing that definition, myself included, because the definition included things that it said were anti-Semitism, which were actually things like critiquing the Israeli state. It listed that as something that could be an example of anti-Semitism. It said that calling the Israeli state a racist endeavor is a form of anti-Semitism. So there are actually like active legislative attempts already, kind of some of them cemented, to prevent people from raising the question of Israel's right to exist, or Israel's existence as a whole. Now, when posed with this question of Israel's right to exist, I think before you can approach that question, I see that someone's put in the chat, yeah, there actually isn't an international law doesn't have this thing called a right of a state to exist, and it's not like, it's not like when the Soviet Union was being dismantled that anyone was saying, well, the Soviet Union has a right to exist as a state, right? That it's just not there. It's not something that actually exists in international law. But obviously, generally international law also recognizes that states have a right to sort of defend themselves and things like that. There is that. There isn't really a formal right to exist in international law. But I think this is a bit of that whole question of Israel's right to exist is a bit of a distraction, actually. I think the key, most important question that this entire debate needs to start with is, what kind of a state is Israel? What kind of a state is Israel, right? This is a question that is you rarely hear this debated, certainly in Western mainstream discourse. And it's a question that we have to explore. And it's a question that Andre sent the reading around. I don't know if everyone's had a chance to read it. I encourage you to do so afterwards if you haven't, but I'll go through a bit of it, right? And what this is it's an exploration of basically what the Zionist movement actually was, its origins, and how it led to the creation of the State of Israel. The starting point for Israel is, so what kind of a state is Israel? It says it's a Jewish state. That's how it self-defines. So that's something of a starting point, but it's more than that. It's a Jewish state, or a state that presents itself as a Jewish state, which was imposed in a land that was predominantly inhabited by people who were not Jewish. There were obviously Jews there, they were a minority, but it was imposed in a land that was predominantly inhabited by people who were not Jewish. That the ideology of that imposition of a Jewish state in Palestine is called Zionism. That's what it is. I go over some of the history of it. It emerged in Europe in the late 1800s. It emerged as a response, in a sense, to anti-Semitism in Europe, which was severe and horrendous. And you see that the logic of Zionism is, well, we're facing oppression and persecution in Europe. There's no way that we can overcome that. And so we must find a state where that is not a state of the British or the French or the Germans, but is a state of the Jews. And that will be the haven where Jews can go to be free from the dangers of anti-Semitism and violence that they have been perpetually, historically subjected to everywhere else. It's an argument that I have there's some sympathy there. Like, I understand where it comes from. Yeah, it comes from a place of facing enormous persecution and needing a place or thinking that the response to that is to find a place, a way where you can be safe with sort of national self-determination as an oppressed people. However, there are some problems with it. First of all, it fully accepts theoretically, it fully accepts most of the assumptions of European colonialism. It emerged in an era of intense colonial theory in Britain, in most of Europe. I mean, it was, what was accepted as the public viewpoint, the mainstream viewpoint, was essentially at that time that the white people of Europe have a right to go anywhere else in the world because they are superior. They are allowed to do with other people's land, resources, labor, markets, and bodies what they choose. And this comes from a sort of hierarchy of races in which the white people are at the top, and everyone else is lower down on the rungs of this. Zionism didn't really reject that. Zionism accepted the framework of race as a starting point. And instead of saying, actually, we need something like a post-racial society, or something like a post-racial politics, an anti-racist politics, it said, we accept the assumption of races and something of a hierarchy. And with that, we stake our claim as the race with the greatest right to a certain land. The land they chose was Palestine. And this kind of raises the second question. Now, there's a sort of historical thing that Israel, the early Zionist movement used to claim, which is that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. You'll have heard this phrase before, maybe. So it argued two things, right? Secondly, the second one is for a people without a land, for the Jewish people who have no other land. And here they find the first part, a land without a people. They said Palestine is a land without a people. Now, they weren't ignorant. They knew there were a people there. But what's really being argued is that these people don't know what to do with the land. They don't actually count. It's just the exact same perspective that European colonizers had in the Americas. Yeah, there are people there, but it's not really, they don't really know what to do with this land. They don't really know how civilization works. They don't really, these people are savages. And they had this exact same perspective on Palestine, on the Palestinian people. There were people there. They were, they actually did know what to do with the land. And, if you ever see these photos of historic Palestine before Zionism and before Israel, it was a beautiful country. But Palestine is a beautiful country. I've been there. I mean, it is gorgeous. And, even in the West Bank, despite all the occupation and all of the horrendous crap you see under the military occupation there, it's a beautiful land, and the Palestinian people are beautiful people, and they know what they have actually a very, very sophisticated understanding of their situation. I'd argue much more sophisticated than the Zionist perspective. But so those are the assumptions that it brought. But this kind of posed a problem for Israel. I do want to go. I have a few quotes throughout this article. I want to highlight the one from Arthur Balfour. As I was saying, I mean, Zionism emerges out of racism, and even the support that it received, like, it wouldn't have been able to do anything without receiving support from imperialism and colonialism and the colonial powers. The first power that really lent its support through its weight behind the Zionist movement was Britain. And it did so with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when, through lobbying from the Zionist movement, which was kind of like it's actually a very marginal movement within the Jewish community of the world as a whole. But, it was there in Europe, and it was, kind of like this fringe political thing. But they managed to get British government support, at least vocalized, for their aspirations in Palestine. And the man who sort of symbolizes that support is Lord Arthur Balfour. He was Foreign Secretary in 1917 of the British state. The exact wording, I have it here in the text: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, so he makes his support, and these two caveats he puts, like, there's plenty of reason to believe he wasn't genuine about both of them. So the first one, that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. As I say in the article, this same Lord Balfour, who has ostensibly cares about protecting the rights of the Palestinians, later said, in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. Zionism is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs and future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that land. So he didn't give a damn about what the Palestinian people, what would be brought upon them by the Zionist movement. And as I said, it's also, there's reason to believe he also didn't agree with the second part of that, which is he said it wouldn't, that also the rights and political status of Jews in other countries would be protected as well. Because Lord Arthur Balfour was a vehement racist. He was an outright racist. And he says, there was a quote from him that I have here, where he's quoted as once saying, and this is him, yeah, and I'm quoting word for word, "We have to face the facts. Men are not born equal. The white and black races are not born with equal capacities. They are born with different capacities, which education cannot and will not change." And as you might expect, his racism wasn't limited to black people or Arabs. He was also anti-Semitic. He said about the Zionist movement, this was his perspective on Zionism. He said that Zionism would, quote, "mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb." What he's saying is the Jewish people in Europe are an alien body that Europe has been unable to expel or to absorb. That he's saying Europe has not found a solution to this problem, which is Jews living in Europe. It can't absorb them and it can't expel them. And so Zionism in his mind was the solution. Get the Jews out of here. We put them in Israel. We put them in Palestine. This is Balfour. This is the man who, Lord Arthur Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, his name more than anything else is tied to symbolizes the link, the relationship between British imperialism and Zionism. And he was an outright racist and anti-Semite. And there are celebrations of the Balfour Declaration today by Israel supporters. I remember we protested a few years ago in London. There was a big, in one of the big halls in London, a big concert celebrating 100 years of the Balfour Declaration in 2017. They had a big concert celebrating this. It's like, guys, this is Lord Arthur Balfour. He's a racist. He's an outright racist and an anti-Semite. But of course, we're the ones who get accused of anti-Semitism, not these people who were actually Zionists. I mean, this guy was one of the most important Zionists in history. So that's the root of what Zionism as an ideology is. And from that root spring massive problems for obviously the Palestinian people, but also significant dilemmas for the Zionists, because they have this objective, which is establish a Jewish state in Palestine, a land, as I said, which is inhabited mostly by non-Jews. And that is an enormous problem. Because how do you do it? How do you establish a Jewish state in a land already mostly where there's not, the majority of people are not Jewish? One way that they tried to support this was through immigration, and they supported massive waves of immigration of Jews into Palestine. Many of these the British government explicitly supported as part of the objective of establishing a Jewish state there. And eventually, I mentioned here that, up until that point, by 1947, when the UN partitions Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, that immigration hadn't really gotten the job done. Only 33% of the population of Palestine was Jewish in 1947, so the problem persisted. The UN partition plan gives 55% of the land to the Jewish state and 45% to an Arab Palestinian state. That is a whole other question that, some history buff can get into at another time as to why that happened. But that also posed the problem. And I have the quote from David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's prime minister, talking about the problem that Israel was facing, this really pressing issue. And his quote goes, "In the area allocated to the Jewish state, there are not more than 520,000 Jews and about 350,000 non-Jews, mostly Arabs. The total population of the Jewish state at the time of its establishment will be about 1 million, including almost 40% non-Jews. Such a composition does not provide a stable basis for a Jewish state. This fact must be viewed in all its clarity and acuteness. With such a composition, there cannot even be absolute certainty that control will remain in the hands of the Jewish majority. There can be no stable and strong Jewish state so long as it has a Jewish majority of only 60%. You see the problem. It's what people have called Israel's demographic threat. The existence of Arabs, essentially, in this land poses a threat to the aspirations of the Zionist movement to have a Jewish state. How do you resolve that threat? There's one way to do it in a way that works. And it was stated, and it's here in the article as well, director of the Jewish National Fund in before Israel was created. His name is Joseph Weitz. He put it this way: must be clear that there is no room in the country for both peoples. The only solution is a land of Israel without Arabs. There is no room here for compromises. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries and to transfer all of them, save perhaps a few. They are talking about ethnic cleansing of the people of Palestine. And they're not exactly wrong to do so, because how else could you have done it? How else could you have done it? There really wasn't another way. And they did do it. And they ethnically cleansed Palestine in 1948. It started in 1947. Israeli militias, or Zionist militias, like you'll have heard of the Irgun and the Haganah, and many of the leaders of these went on to become like leaders within Israel, including Ben Gurion himself, who was in the Haganah. Yeah, they led military campaigns against Palestinian towns and villages, massacring people from Arab towns across the land of Palestine. They killed about 15,000 people and expelled 700. The estimates run from between 750 to 850,000 Palestinians who were expelled from that land. And you'll remember Balfour, when he was talking about the number of Arabs, he estimated at 700,000 in 1917. So this was almost the entire Arab population of Palestine was either killed or ethnically cleansed, expelled from that land. Today, Israel's population is 80% Jewish, and it sort of stays around that number, and about 20% Arab, well above David Ben-Gurion's 60%, right? And this is how they accomplished that. Was through immense, overwhelming colonial violence against the people of Palestine. And they were never allowed to return. Yeah. Oh, I should have mentioned 500 Palestinian towns and villages wiped off the map. And you have to keep that in mind, because people will say, these Palestinian folks, they want to wipe Israel off the map. I mean, well, we can talk about that, but let's talk first about the fact Israel has already wiped Palestine off the map. That has happened. It's not something that's being talked about or being accused. It has happened. It's a done deal. It's a fact. Today, Israel continues to deny the rights of Palestinians to return to their land. These are rights that are guaranteed for the Palestinians in international law in many forms, right? So first of all, the Balfour Declaration itself, which was the basis of this project, says nothing can be done to hinder the rights of non-Jews living there. The Partition Plan of 1947 said that nothing about this plan can be used to hurt the rights of non-Jews living in the land apportioned to the Jewish state. Also, there have been many UN resolutions since then confirming that. And yet Israel continues to deny the Palestinians their right to exist. And here's a fact that in what's happened recently that I haven't heard almost anyone talk about it. The only person I've heard talk about is Norman Finkelstein and, people in that sort of class. Over 2/3 of the population of Gaza is refugees from the land that is now the Israeli state. So when we're talking about the people of Gaza, we are talking about people who either they themselves were expelled or they're the descendants of people who were expelled in 1948. It's about 70% of the population of Gaza are themselves already refugees from the land that is now the state of Israel. That's a pretty important thing to consider when we look at what's happened in this context. Yeah. And here's I think the bottom line. It's that the Zionist movement had to do this. There was no other way to accomplish the state that it wanted, which was a state in Palestine, a Jewish state in Palestine, in a land already inhabited by non-Jews. There was no other way. And Israeli leaders knew it. Zionist leaders knew it. They've said it explicitly. And there are other statements all confirming this same thing. It was the most pressing thing on their mind in this situation. And because of that, they brought the violence upon the Palestinian people that expelled them from their land. And to this day, Zionism and that that project, that aspiration to maintain this state continues to be a source of, in my view, all of the problems that have emerged around the question of Israel and Palestine, including all of the violence. I mean, Zionism essentially necessitates, the only way to maintain this kind of a state in stolen land is through violence. And so Zionism and its continuation necessitates both Israeli violence. Israeli violence is a product of Zionism. It is the inevitable and totally expected violence of the colonizer, protecting itself and its spoils from the colonized people it has dispossessed. The Palestinian violence is also a product of Zionism. It is the inevitable violence of the colonized, dispossessed, fighting against their colonizer. So the core question here is Zionism. And insofar as Israel is a Zionist state, I mean, that is a big problem. Yeah. And it, in my view, is the root of the entire Israel-Palestine question. And I mentioned, you know, the demographic threat. I mentioned in the article as well that, you know, even within the state of Israel, like there are attacks on Arab towns there in the Negev Desert in the south of Israel. There are a lot of Bedouin, like Palestinian towns there, villages that have been repeatedly attacked again and again. And there was an interesting statement by Netanyahu in 2010. One of these villages is called El Araqib, a small Bedouin village in the Negev, was attacked by 1,300 armed Israeli police and destroyed. They destroyed 45 homes, left 300 people homeless, half of them children. And what's interesting about this is that, well, first of all, one interesting thing is that this same town has had that happen to it by that point over 130 times, and they just rebuild it. They rebuild it, and the government attacks it again. They rebuild, and this happened 130 times, yeah, to this one village. But what's more interesting, in my view, well, equally interesting, is that a few days before that attack, Netanyahu, who was prime minister at the time, people will know Netanyahu's had quite a few kicks at the can as prime minister over the decades. Yeah, so he was also prime minister in 2010. And he had told people just a couple days before that a Negev, this region, that a Negev, quote, without a Jewish majority would be a palpable threat to the Israeli state. This demographic question poses itself again and again and again. What is the threat posed by an Arab village in the Israeli state? You can't understand it unless you understand what Zionism really is. And here's the key thing, is that when Netanyahu and Ben Gurion talk about Arab towns and Arab populations being a threat to the Israeli state, they are absolutely correct. They are 100% correct, because the Israeli state, as a Zionist state, which is what it is, can only exist as a Jewish Zionist state by excluding the Palestinians, by denying them their rights, by denying the refugees their right to return, by denying Palestinians their right to their homeland, by repeatedly suppressing any attempts of the Palestinians to resist, whether violently or non-violent resistance from the Palestinians. Israel represses both with equal severity. And all of those things are actually necessary to maintain the Zionist state, because if you were ever to grant the full political rights to the Palestinian people, it's not clear how you could have a Zionist state anymore, how you could have a Jewish state. It simply wouldn't be a majority. If you let the refugees return to their land, you lose a Jewish majority. Another thing that's been proposed a lot recently by people who support Palestine is a one-state solution. Let Israel annex the West Bank and Gaza. They clearly want them anyway. Let them annex them, extend citizenship to the Palestinians who live there, which you're required to do when you annex a territory under international law. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of international law problems with an annexation like that, but Palestinians have been saying, okay, do it. Bring us into the state then. We'll become Israelis. The problem is Israel can't do that, because in a very short time, the Arabs would become the majority given current birth rates. I mean, it would already be around 50% if they were to do that, Arab like the Arab population of Israel would massively expand in its proportionally, and the question again of a Jewish majority in that state would be put into jeopardy. This is the core of the problem. This is the heart of the problem, and the key thing to see is this: the Palestinian people, by merely existing as human beings with a claim to political and national rights, actually pose a threat to the state of Israel. Not because of any threat they pose, like in terms of people's lives or in terms of safety and security for Israelis, but simply by existing, they are a threat to the Zionist goal, to the Zionist aspiration of maintaining a Jewish state there. And that is what we mean when we say that Israel is a Zionist state, when people say that Israel is a racist state. And so when we're asking then this question, does Israel have a right to exist? Does Israel have a right to exist? Well, what kind of a state are you saying that Israel has a right to exist as? Because if you're making the point that Israel has a right to exist as an exclusionary, anti-Arab, colonial, violent settler state, then no, that's not something I think any of us should be accepting. So, and that's the heart of the conflict, and that's what we're seeing today. Is, today we're seeing the violence of the colonizer fighting the colonized, and it's totally unclear where things are going to be when the dust settles here. But at the end, long term, at the end of the day, there is never going to be a resolution to this question, so long as Zionism is still on the table. There can never be peace. It's just not possible. I mean, there is one kind of peace that's possible without getting rid of Zionism, and that's the peace of genocide. Yeah, you murder and massacre every last Palestinian man, woman, and child, and you establish a peaceful state of Israel on their graves. That might be a way to peace. If I were advising the Zionists, I might say, hey, there's one possibility, but I don't need to advise them that, because they're already doing it. They're already doing it right now in Gaza. They've shown that that's exactly what they want to do. But if you want a serious peace, it has to be a just peace, and it has to be based on a post-racist vision for Palestine. And what is that vision? What is the vision the Palestinian people have? And I told some of you this last session, and I'll repeat it again. I'm going to put it in the words of a Palestinian man that I met in the West Bank. We were driving through the West Bank, and we were driving past some settlements, and he pointed up at the settlements. This is a man who must have lived his entire life under this military occupation, pointing at the settlements. And as you'll know, the settlers are among the most vicious against the Palestinian people. And yet, despite that, what he said was, I don't even want these people to leave. Pointing at the settlers, I don't even want these people to leave. I just want to be able to live with them as an equal in freedom and peace. Yeah. That's what the Palestinian vision for freedom is. And they want that kind of freedom from the river to the sea. So that's what the phrase means. Thank you all for your attention.
Great job, Wesam. Amazing.
Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or people have comments or anything like that.
My only comment is, well, first of all, amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. But I'm sorry you got arrested, and thank you for fighting for freedom.
Thank you, comrade. Solidarity, and I know we've yet to hear of some of the ways that you've faced that repression as well. So solidarity to you as well, comrade.
I was gonna say, I know you said you're not quite permitted to organize so much anymore, but I'm kind of in need of some connections with some people in Windsor, Ontario.
Okay, I'll see. Do you want to message me? I'll send you a private thing here. Yeah.
Sounds good.
So what if like someone was
Same for
holding a
me here.
megaphone
I'm
close
in.
to their mouth?
Sorry, I think two people were speaking at the same time there. Can do you want to go first, Zena,
Go ahead.
and then Emily?
Okay. I was just asking, what if someone was holding like a megaphone close to your mouth? How does that work legally?
Well, the word was possession, which is a legally complicated concept, actually. So honestly, I don't know. I'm just glad that I don't have to answer that question because they've been dropped now. So
It's a loophole.
Emily, I think you were saying something.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to, same thing as Mike. I'm in Quebec though, but you know, I see all these spontaneous actions coming up. Like today in Montreal, there was like a blocking of a bridge, and I mean, I don't live in the city, but I keep seeing these things and thinking, well, who's organizing this stuff? Like, I want to be there, but I don't hear about it till I see it on the news. Like, I've been to the protests every weekend. Yeah, and I wanted to say I really enjoyed the speech, like the written, but also, you know, the presentation you gave today. And it was a lot of quotes and points that I hadn't come across before. And especially the connection, like the text you had mentioned from Churchill and the connection between Zionism and Bolshevism, or not the connection, but like, you know, the anti-communist McCarthyist connection, I thought was really interesting. And yeah, if you know, if there's anything you ever need, you need help, support, you know, as your case proceeds, obviously we're there for you. So just let us know.
Thank you. I'll keep you guys posted.
I wanted to say, Wesam, thanks so much for that presentation. It was really, really informative. I have so much respect for the Palestinian people and their supporters in the region, because they really are at the forefront of anti-imperialism today. And unfortunately, they're bearing the brunt of the empire at the moment, and they're being used as almost as examples, you know, to say this is what happens when you challenge the empire. And you know, anti-imperialism is benefiting. The anti-imperialist goals are just, you know, being pushed so much ahead and forward because of the Palestinian struggle. I was wondering, to what extent is Israel, your thoughts on what the extent that Israel is being used as a proxy by the United States, similar to Ukraine or Taiwan. Of course, you know, material conditions are different. But yeah, just your thoughts on that, because even, you know, it's just not a sustainable model, you know, to be, what are they just going to be at constant war, you know, with their neighbors? It's not sustainable. It doesn't make sense, even, you know, for Israelis. Yeah, just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. It's a proxy, and it started as a proxy. And this is something I didn't really go into in my talk, but it's kind of there in the article, which is that like Israel is only able to exist as a sort of outpost of the imperial core. I kind of like to I kind of say that like Israel is a European country in the Middle East, basically. It certainly presents itself that way, and it's you know its ability to maintain itself, it just wouldn't be there without imperial support. And it started with Britain. I mean, the whole Zionist project couldn't have been established without British support. And today, it just couldn't exist without US support. It's become basically an appendage of US imperialism. There's a quote in the article that I didn't get to, but I'll mention it now since you raised it, which is that the man who would become the military governor of Jerusalem in 1917, the same year as the Balfour Declaration, said about the Zionist movement, this was his words, that the Zionist movement would create a, quote, little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And those of you who were with us for the set of series of courses we were doing with Danny will get the reference to Ulster. It's Britain's center of support in Ireland. That section of Ireland, which basically became a sort of base of operations for the British occupation of Ireland. And that's how Britain saw Israel. This will be our little Ulster in the Middle East for us to sort of have the tip of the imperialist spear. And today, the United States sees Israel in the exact same way. Yeah.
Powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be able to support itself. The amount of military aid and economic aid that the United States gives to Israel is like a lifeline for that country. And not to mention, the United States' enormous outsized role in protecting Israel from any kind of international accountability through the UN or the International Criminal Court or anything like that. And I think it's important because it's important to stress that because that kind of puts the onus on us here as well. We have to recognize our responsibility here. That it's actually our governments here that are enabling this to go on. And as much as obviously the liberation of the Palestinians is their movement first and foremost, and it's for them to liberate themselves, it's for us to provide open doors for the liberation by confronting the states here. And I mean, that's the gauntlet's thrown down for us in a sense, comrades. What can we do here? Because without the support Israel receives from the spot where we're all standing, it wouldn't be able to continue this. So it's an important question for us to consider as activists here. Are there any other questions or comments or anything? Otherwise, we might move on.
I have a quick question. Sorry. So when the Israel colonizing started to happen, were the most settlers come from the bourgeois class, or just all across the class, whether it's working class or the rich class? Were they all would the settlers only consist of the bourgeois class? That's what I was trying to ask. In the Israel.
It's a good question, and I wish I had a fully informed answer for you. I can tell you that the origins of the movement were kind of middle class, and it kind of makes sense. And again, as somebody mentioned, the whole Winston Churchill Bolshevism versus Zionism article that I mentioned in the piece. The working class Jewish politics tended to lean towards communism. Ruling class Jewish politics, I think, were a little bit, and as far as the bourgeois class is concerned, tended a little bit more towards actually where we can kind of get by here in Europe. We're kind of comfortable here. So it was a little more of a middle class movement that the Zionist movement emerged out of. But it changes, it gets complicated because a lot of refugees fleeing the Holocaust end up in Palestine, right? And their class composition is, much more complicated. So there isn't really, I can't really say that there's that, as far as I know, that there's any clear, but honestly, I'm not the person to ask about that. I'm sure there are other people who are better informed. If anyone here has a better answer than that, please speak up.
I can jump in on that if it's helpful. First off, yeah, Wesam, that was an incredible talk, very succinct, an incredible synthesis. My only question is how can we get that out to 340 million people in the United States, and I don't know the population of Canada off the top of my head, but you know, that's a talk connecting the repression that you have been through, and then why they've had to repress your freedom of speech, your freedom of consciousness, freedom of assembly, and all of the bourgeois rights that they parade around with all of their rhetoric defending that they've violated. These are all excellent teaching points where we can intervene. Before I address Daniel's very important question there, just greetings from, I don't know if you've ever heard of Slab City, but Slab City, way out near the border of Mexico and Eastern California. It's an encampment of, it's kind of an off-the-grid, self-organized encampment. So I was over there. Thanks so much to Andres and Wesam, and we'll hear soon from Ariana and everyone who was behind the scenes organizing this, and my dear friend, comrade, and mentor, Fred Mills, who's been doing this work now for a long time. Fred's really an expert on the anti-Bukele resistance in El Salvador. He just returned from El Salvador late this summer. I'll just say one sentence about Bukele because he likes to brag about his popularity rate being super, super high, which indeed it is. He's considered now perhaps the most popular leader in Latin America, with somewhere between 80 to 90% support, but that should be, of course, read very critically. But I think the main point with Bukele, he always goes after the oppressed. He scapegoats the gang members. He goes after the true oligarchs. And he himself is an aspiring oligarch, trying to represent perhaps another emerging wing of the Salvadorian bourgeoisie. So Fred's a real expert on El Salvador. Returning to Daniel's question, the original ideologues, Theodor Herzl, the journalist from Austria, some of the other Zionist ideologues in the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia and across Eastern Europe, their class roots were very different than the Jewish communities that they had to galvanize and organize because they needed both. Wesam talked about the quote-unquote population war. That's one of the main Zionist arguments. They'll say this is not a genocide, it's grow. So they're actually very mindful that this is, in Zionist terms, this is a population race. I mean, this is how sick this ideology is. But they needed to convince tens of thousands, and over the course of years and decades, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of the everyday Jews across Europe that they should embark upon this Zionist project, that they should board these British war boats, these British military ships, and part for Palestine. The authoritative work on this period of history, I mean, it began in the 1880s and the 1890s, but it didn't really begin in erstwhile 100% World War II, post-World War II. And again, this was the Europeans exporting their quote-unquote Jewish problem or Jewish question. Now, Abraham Leon, we didn't get to his work, but he wrote a great book that I referenced, at least. The Jewish Question by Abraham Leon is an authoritative Marxist view of the Jewish question. as it was framed in the European context. Abraham Leon is a Belgian Marxist and a Belgian Jew who is able to smuggle out this important Marxist work before he is sent off to Auschwitz. And along with, I don't know if it was 90% of European Jewry that was incinerated in the Nazi furnaces. But what Abraham Leon puts out is an argument that the Jewish people composed a unique, I think he framed it, we'll have to double check. I clearly don't have the work in front of me as I drive across California. He framed the Jewish people, because the Jewish people don't constitute a nation, right? Let's go back to the Marxist definition of a nation. Or does anyone remember? I think that was from class number, we probably covered the Marxist definition of a nation in the class on Ireland, or perhaps before that. I think the class on Ireland was 7th class. Does anyone remember the Marxist definition of a nation? Does anyone want to refer back to their copious notes? I'll just give it unless anyone wants to intervene. Lenin and Stalin write on this extensively. The idea of a nation of people is that it's a unique, dynamic community of people who share a similar history and often a similar language and often a similar claim to a historic land. So the Palestinian people are a nation because their language was Arabic. Historically, they had a shared experience, whether they were Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims. They lived on this land. Again, back to the slogan of from the river to the sea. That's why they're so afraid of that chant, because that chant embodies and projects the historical claim of a specific land which the Palestinian nation had a right to. So if you apply the traditional Marxist definition of a nation, we can see very clearly that some Jews whose language was, well, many Jews whose language was Yiddish, other Jews whose first language would have been German, maybe they spoke both languages, other Jews who define themselves first as proletarians and internationalists, second as Poles, and third as Jews. Other Jews who were deeply religious and spiritual and define themselves as Jew first, second, and third. The point that I'm making is that the disparate Jewish communities spread across mostly Eastern Europe didn't form one unique nation. So Abraham Leon says that I can't say whether his conclusion is 100% Marxist or not. I mean, it's a book that should be studied. But his conclusion is that the Jewish people comprised a unique, I think he called it a nation class or a nation class economic group. But what he set out to look at is that Jewish people, because of their marginalization, were often forced into the pores of society. That's a quote directly from Marx. Because in many of the anti-Semitic, the true definition of anti-Semitism, which they want to be lost upon us, and after Ariana goes, with the permission of the facilitator, Andres is running this. I can talk a little bit about my own personal experience with the doxing and the repression, because yesterday I had to address the Latin American Studies Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I'll preface it just by saying what I said to them, how ridiculous that in in these highly, highly intense moments. And Wesam said it. Wesam said, Wesam, I can't put out his age, but he's been doing this for a while. You can hear it in his delivery. You can hear it in his ideological preparation, his ideological training. I mean, that was, I don't know if I've ever heard such an anti-Zionist synthesis. I mean, we need, if that was 41 minutes, we need those 41 minutes out there so that they can be devoured by anti-Zionist youth and the anti-Zionist masses that we're trying to train around the world. The world is anti-Zionist. The problem is the United States in the quote unquote Western democracies. So just finishing with Abraham Leon's thesis, I know it's a bit of a extensive answer. Daniel probably didn't know he was asking a bit of a historically nuanced question.
Oh no, that wasn't it. Yeah,
I'm
thank you for
concluding.
your-
So the settlers did not go as wannabe settlers or conscious Lord Balfour says colonial Rick. They were, I mean, to say between a rock and a hard place is obviously an understatement. They were fleeing the furnaces. They were fleeing, Isaac Deutscher, who we should all study. Isaac Deutscher is an excellent, excellent Marxist writer. He's such a great writer, in fact, that in the Soviet Union, instead of giving the Pulitzer Prize, they gave the Deutscher Prize for history writing because he was such a phenomenal historian. I highly recommend that we study Deutsch's work in the future. But he wrote a book called The Non-Jewish Jew. And Deutscher, in one of his final chapters, because Deutscher was an anti-Zionist, these generations of Marxist Jews are, of course, anti-Zionist because they can foresee everything that we're laying out, that this is a colonial question, and that Europe is trying to flex its colonial muscles and invent Israel. So you have Jewish communities across Eastern Europe that are very, very divided over this. There were three main expressions of Jewish leftism. Can you still hear me? Because I have a phone call coming in that I don't want to interrupt me. Are
we
you
can
still
hear
able
you.
to hear me? All right. So the three expressions that come out of left-wing Jewish leadership and the masses. You have the Pole Zion. I forget if that's in Yiddish or in Polish, and I forget how to pronounce it. But it's more or less spelled Pole Zion, which are the ones saying we're going to go establish the kibbutzes, we're going to go establish socialism in Palestine. That's one expression. The next expression is the Bund. These are local left-wing union expressions, syndicalism, Jewish communities organizing around trade unions. But they're anti-Zionist, as well as the third expression, which is the Marxist, Leninist Jews. So the second two expressions, the second and third expressions are anti-Zionist because they're saying, well, how could we be progressive? How could we be left-wing? How could we be Marxist and go invade a colonized people's land? Because the Palestinians had already been colonized. It wasn't called Palestine. It was called the British Mandate. And there's the Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1917, where the Middle Eastern borders are not drawn in Cairo. They're not drawn in Beirut. They're not drawn in Amman. They're drawn in where all colonial borders are drawn, in Paris and in London. So the bulk of these settlers, and if you watch the French documentary Palestine, Story of a Land, I think Daniel was able to track it down. We have to start using last names because there's so many Daniels. You see these super, super, super impoverished survivors, super traumatized, super thin. So they weaponize the survivors of the Holocaust. They weaponize the refugees because they need Jewish bodies. So the vast majority of these early settlers, many of them are almost beyond working class. They're survivors of the Holocaust. And I did an interview a few weeks back with a personal friend, Amos, forgetting his last name now, but it begins with a P. And his parents came from that category of Holocaust survivors. They were conscripted into the British Army. Overnight, the British Army becomes the Israeli Army because that was the vision as Wesam laid out, right? To use Israel as a giant battle ram to do the West's bidding in the Middle East. So that speaks to some of the class character of the early settlers, but certainly the ideological leadership came from a bourgeois and a petty bourgeois background, the early Zionists, but they had a problem as they tried to project this racist mythology, these racist pamphlets that were saying a land without a people for a people without a land. They needed that people. So they had to recruit, they had to convince, and they needed the British Empire to actually support tens of thousands of surviving Jews from that part of Europe. So that's that, the beginning of an answer to Daniel's question.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So, okay, Danny, go ahead. Okay. So Ariana messaged me that she had a hard stop at 10. She had to leave. So officially the class is over.
I feel bad. I spoke for too long. Hopefully get her on next week. Yeah, I'll message her.
So I don't know, I guess we can stop the recording.